The mother thought she was going to have twins, and then the doctor noticed something terrible. Hello, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment what you think is going to happen, and let's see if you get it right. Write your prediction below, and at the end, I'll give you the answer. From the very beginning, Mary had felt something was different about this pregnancy. As an experienced mother of two, she was familiar with the signs. The fatigue, the morning sickness, the subtle movements in her belly. But this time, everything seemed amplified. The doctor had told her it was twins, explaining the heightened symptoms, and she had accepted that explanation with joy and excitement. Twins! It felt like a miracle, a double blessing that would complete her family. As the months passed, Mary and her husband, David, prepared for their new arrivals. 2 cribs, double the clothes, and even matching names. Everything was set for their perfect future. However, something kept nagging at Mary. She felt it in her bones, a mother's intuition, whispering that something wasn't quite right. Every time she mentioned it to the doctor, her concerns were dismissed. "It's normal with twins," he reassured her again and again. But as she lay awake at night, feeling the erratic movements inside her, she couldn't shake the feeling that something far more serious was happening. It wasn't just the usual discomfort. It was a sensation that one of the babies was in distress. Deep down, Mary knew this pregnancy was different in ways she couldn't explain. At her final prenatal appointment, the uneasiness reached a breaking point. The ultrasound technician furrowed her brow as she studied the screen. There was a long pause, followed by a whispered conversation between the technician and the doctor. Mary's heart began to race. David squeezed her hand reassuringly, but she could feel his tension too. The room grew colder as the doctor finally spoke. "Mary, we need to talk. There's something we didn't catch before." Her heart stopped. The words seemed to echo in the sterile air, filling the space between them with a growing sense of dread. Mary's mind raced, her worst fears clawing their way to the surface. What could it be? Was something wrong with one of the babies? Was it something that couldn't be fixed? The doctor's expression was grave as he turned the monitor towards them. "It's not twins," he said softly. "There's something else, something much more complex." He hesitated for a moment before delivering the crushing news. The baby wasn't developing as expected. It wasn't a second heartbeat they had been hearing. It was something far more terrifying. The silence in the room was deafening. Mary's mind struggled to process the doctor's words. Not twins? What did that even mean? She stared blankly at the monitor, her heart pounding in her chest, while David sat beside her, equally bewildered. The ultrasound image flickered on the screen, but all Mary could see was a blur. The doctor, sensing their confusion, took a deep breath and began to explain. "What we initially thought was the second heartbeat wasn't another baby," he said cautiously. "It appears that your baby has a rare condition that we didn't detect earlier." The words hit Mary like a freight train. Her hands instinctively went to her stomach, as if to shield the life growing inside her. David leaned forward, his voice shaking as he asked, "What condition? What's wrong with our baby?" The doctor hesitated, clearly choosing his words with care. "There's an abnormal mass growing alongside the baby. It's incredibly rare and unfortunately, it's been mimicking the signs of a twin pregnancy. We need to run further tests to understand the full extent of the situation, but it's clear this isn't a normal complication." Tears welled up in Mary's eyes as she looked at David, the excitement they had felt just days ago now replaced by sheer terror. All the preparations for twins, the dreams of holding 2 babies in her arms, crumbled in an instant. Instead, they were faced with an unknown battle, one that neither of them had anticipated. The doctor's voice became a blur in the background as Mary's mind raced through a million questions. Would their baby survive? What would happen next? The weight of it all was too much to bear, and she broke down, sobbing into David's shoulder. After what felt like an eternity, the doctor spoke again, this time more gently. "We have specialists who can help guide you through this. We'll perform more detailed scans and tests, but I want you both to prepare for a challenging road ahead." He paused, allowing his words to sink in before adding, "The baby's life is at risk, and we'll need to monitor the situation very closely. There's still hope, but it's going to be difficult." Mary barely registered the last part. Hope. The word seemed so far from where they were right now. The ride home was painfully quiet. Neither Mary nor David knew what to say. The excitement that had once filled their home now seemed like a distant memory, replaced by an overwhelming fear of the unknown. Mary sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, trying to make sense of it all. How had everything changed so quickly? A few days ago, they had been celebrating the arrival of twins. Now they were faced with the possibility that their baby might not make it. The future, once so bright, had become a terrifying void. The days that followed the devastating news were a blur for Mary. She felt as if she were living in a nightmare, one she couldn't escape. Every movement in her belly was a reminder of the life growing inside her, and of the terrible uncertainty that surrounded it. Her nights were sleepless, her mind consumed with thoughts of the baby and the unknown future. David tried his best to be her rock, but she could see the fear in his eyes too. They were both trapped in a state of helplessness, waiting for answers that seemed impossible to find. The appointments with specialists came one after another. Each visit brought more scans, more tests, and more grim discussions about the risks. The mass growing alongside the baby wasn't just an ordinary complication. It was a condition so rare that even the doctors struggled to provide a clear prognosis. The danger it posed to their child's development was severe, and every day seemed to bring new challenges. The doctors outlined the potential scenarios, some hopeful, others too terrifying for Mary to fully comprehend. Despite the mounting pressure, Mary found a strength within herself she didn't know she had. The thought of losing her baby was unbearable, but she wasn't ready to give up. She spent hours researching everything she could about the condition, asking questions, and pushing the doctors for any possible solution. "There has to be something we can do," she insisted at every meeting, refusing to accept defeat. David, though shaken, supported her determination. Together, they clung to the fragile hope that their baby could survive, that they could somehow overcome the odds stacked against them. As the weeks passed, Mary began to form a connection with her unborn child in a way she hadn't expected. Each kick, each flutter inside her, became a reminder of the fight they were in together. She spoke to the baby often, whispering promises of love and protection, as if her words alone could shield it from the impending danger. "You're strong," she would say, her hand resting on her stomach. "We'll get through this." It was in those moments, alone with her thoughts, that she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a miracle, no matter how slim. The doctors, while cautious, couldn't help but admire Mary's resilience. They offered her every option available, from surgeries to advanced treatments, but the reality was always the same. The outcome was uncertain, and the risks were enormous. Still, Mary refused to waver. She knew the road ahead would be long and painful, but as a mother, she couldn't accept anything less than giving her child the best possible chance at life. David stood by her side, his silent support a steady presence through the storm. Together, they braced for whatever was to come. As Mary entered the final stretch of her pregnancy, the weight of the situation became almost unbearable. The appointments with specialists were now a regular part of her life, each one filled with technical terms, graphs, and probabilities that offered little comfort. The abnormal mass was growing alongside the baby, and the risk of complications during birth was high. Yet, despite all the frightening statistics, there was still a sliver of hope, and that's what Mary clung to. Her belly was large, and she could feel her baby's movements constantly, a reminder that her child was still fighting inside her. David tried his best to remain strong, but there were moments when the fear in his eyes betrayed him. They had always shared everything, but now, each of them was locked in their own private battle with dread. One evening, as they sat together in the nursery they had lovingly prepared, David finally let his guard down. "I'm scared, Mary," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I don't know how we're supposed to get through this." Mary placed her hand on his and squeezed gently. "We'll get through it," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. "We have to believe that our baby is strong." As the due date approached, the medical team began preparing for the birth. It would be a high-risk delivery, with a team of surgeons on standby in case things went wrong. The doctors had explained the potential complications, but Mary had stopped listening to the specifics. All she could focus on was the thought of holding her baby in her arms, of hearing that first cry and knowing that everything would be okay. The fear that something could go wrong gnawed at her constantly, but she had no choice but to put her faith in the doctors and hope for the best. The night before the scheduled delivery, Mary couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, her hand resting on her swollen belly, feeling the familiar movements of the baby inside her. Each kick was a reminder of the life she was about to bring into the world, but also of the terrifying unknown that awaited them both. She whispered to the baby, as she had done so many times before. "You're strong," she murmured. "We're going to meet you soon. I love you so much." Tears welled up in her eyes as she thought about what the next day might bring. She wasn't ready for the possibility of loss, but she knew she had to be strong for her child. The morning of the delivery was filled with tension. The hospital room was bright and sterile, filled with the sound of machines beeping steadily. David was by her side, his hand gripping hers tightly as they waited. The doctors and nurses moved around them, preparing for the procedure, their faces focused and serious. Mary's heart pounded in her chest as the minutes ticked by. This was it, the moment they had been waiting for, the moment that would determine everything. As the doctors gave the final instructions, Mary took a deep breath and closed her eyes, praying silently that their baby would survive the ordeal ahead. The delivery room buzzed with the energy of anticipation and fear. Mary lay on the table, her heart racing as the doctors prepared for the high-risk procedure. Every muscle in her body was tense, her thoughts focused on one thing, her baby. David was right by her side, holding her hand tightly, offering silent support. The room was packed with specialists, neonatal doctors, surgeons, nurses, all of them aware that this was no ordinary birth. As the procedure began, the sterile smell of the room mixed with the rhythmic beeping of the monitors, creating a surreal atmosphere. Mary's mind wandered briefly, trying to imagine what her baby would look like. She had dreamed about this moment so many times, picturing the joy of holding her child for the first time, hearing that first cry. But now, those dreams were clouded with the reality of the situation. The doctors had warned her that there was a high chance of complications, that the abnormal mass could pose a serious threat to the baby's life. Mary braced herself for whatever was to come, knowing that the next few moments would change everything. Suddenly, the room erupted into action. Mary felt a wave of pressure as the baby was delivered, followed by a tense silence. She held her breath, waiting for the sound she had been dreading and longing for, the first cry. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours, and just as panic began to set in, a faint but unmistakable cry filled the room. It was weak, but it was there. Mary's heart swelled with relief and fear all at once. The doctors rushed to stabilize the baby, who had been whisked away to the neonatal unit for immediate care. The mass that had grown alongside the baby was being dealt with surgically, and the air in the room felt heavy with the uncertainty of the next few hours. David squeezed Mary's hand as tears streamed down her face. "Our baby's here," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. But even as he said the words, both of them knew the fight was far from over. Their child was alive, but the road ahead was still perilous. The doctors worked with quiet urgency, stabilizing the tiny infant and preparing for the next critical steps. Mary's exhaustion from the delivery washed over her, but she refused to let herself rest until she knew more. "Is the baby okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. One of the doctors approached them, his face serious but calm. "Your baby is stable for now," he said, his tone measured. "But we need to continue monitoring closely. The mass was larger than we expected, and we'll need to perform additional procedures to ensure the baby remains safe." Mary felt a lump form in her throat as she nodded, trying to absorb the information. Her baby was alive, but the fight was far from over. The doctor continued, "We've done everything we can for now. The next few days will be critical." As Mary was wheeled into recovery, her thoughts were consumed with fear for her newborn. She had longed to hold her baby, to cradle them in her arms and feel the warmth of their small body against her chest. But instead, she was left waiting once again. David sat beside her, his eyes filled with the same mixture of relief and dread. "Our baby is strong," Mary whispered, more to convince herself than anyone else. "We just have to keep believing." David nodded, his hand still gripping hers tightly. Together they waited, knowing that their child's fight for life had only just begun. The days following the birth felt like an eternity for Mary and David. Their baby was in the neonatal intensive care unit, NICU, hooked up to a web of tubes and machines that monitored every tiny movement, every breath. Mary had imagined this moment so many times, holding her child, feeling the soft weight of a newborn against her chest. Instead, she found herself sitting helplessly by the incubator, watching as nurses and doctors moved quickly around her baby, their expressions a mix of focus and concern. The abnormal mass, which had been their nightmare throughout the pregnancy, was now the focus of constant medical attention. The doctors had managed to remove a portion of it during the birth, but the danger was far from over. The mass had affected some of the baby's vital organs, and the road to recovery would be long and filled with uncertainty. Every day brought a new set of challenges. Some days, the baby's condition would improve, giving Mary and David a glimmer of hope, but other days were filled with setbacks that brought them crashing back to reality. Mary spent hours at the hospital, refusing to leave her child's side. She would sit by the incubator, whispering words of encouragement through the glass. "You're strong," she would say softly, her hand resting on the transparent cover. "You're going to make it." Every time the baby moved, even just a slight flutter of tiny fingers or toes, it filled her with hope. David was there too, as often as he could be, but the weight of the situation was taking its toll on both of them. They had gone from expecting twins to fighting for the life of their one fragile miracle. The nurses, always compassionate, tried to comfort Mary and David as best they could. They explained every procedure, every medication, every tiny milestone, but there was no escaping the fear that clung to them like a shadow. Mary had never felt so helpless. She was a mother, but she couldn't protect her child from the dangers that lurked inside that tiny body. The doctors were doing everything they could, but there were no guarantees. It was a waiting game, and every moment was a test of their strength and faith. Then one day, the doctors delivered a small but significant piece of good news. The baby had turned a corner, showing signs of improvement that they hadn't seen before. The mass, though still present, was shrinking, and the baby's vital signs were stabilizing. Mary could hardly believe it. After weeks of uncertainty and fear, there was finally a glimmer of light. Tears of relief filled her eyes as she listened to the doctor's cautious optimism. "We're not out of the woods yet," he warned, "but this is a positive sign." For the first time since the birth, Mary allowed herself to breathe a little easier. The baby's fight was far from over, but they were moving in the right direction. That night, as Mary sat by the incubator, she placed her hand against the glass and whispered, "We're getting there. You're strong, and you're going to make it." It was a promise she had made many times before, but now it felt more real than ever. David stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, as they watched their child sleep peacefully for the first time in what felt like forever. The days following the baby's improvement were cautiously hopeful. For the first time, Mary and David allowed themselves to dream again, but they did so with guarded hearts. Every tiny victory felt monumental. The baby's oxygen levels stabilizing, the heartbeats growing stronger, and even the simple act of feeding without complications. But they knew that with every step forward, there could easily be a step back. Life in the NICU was unpredictable, and they had learned to live with the uncertainty that each new day would bring. Mary became a fixture in the NICU, watching over her child with an intensity only a mother could have. She learned the rhythms of the machines, the meaning of every beep and hum. She had grown close to the nurses, sharing brief conversations filled with medical jargon and small updates. But beyond the technicalities, Mary was still just a mother who wanted to hold her baby. The first time she was allowed to touch her child's fragile skin, through the soft openings of the incubator, she felt a wave of emotion so intense that it nearly took her breath away. That moment, however brief, reminded her of what they were fighting for, the life of this tiny miracle. David continued to balance his time between the hospital and home, where the empty nursery waited, still filled with all the things they had bought for twins. Each time he walked by the room, his heart ached with the memory of their earlier joy. It was a strange and painful contrast, preparing for two, but now fighting to save one. The grief of what they had lost mingled with the hope of what still remained, and it weighed heavily on him. But he couldn't let himself fall apart. He had to stay strong for Mary, for their baby, and for the future they still clung to. Then came a new challenge. The doctors discovered that although the mass had shrunk, it was still impacting the baby's lungs. Surgery would be required to remove more of the tissue, and the risks were high. Mary's heart sank as the doctor explained the procedure. Once again, they were faced with terrifying decisions, weighing the risks of surgery against the dangers of leaving the mass untreated. David sat beside her, his face pale but determined. "We have to do what's best for the baby," he said softly. Mary nodded, though her heart was breaking. How much more could their tiny child endure? The surgery was scheduled for the following morning, and that night, Mary couldn't sleep. She sat by the incubator, watching her baby's chest rise and fall with each fragile breath. The thought of another surgery, another risk, was almost too much to bear. She whispered to her baby through the glass, her voice barely audible. "You're the bravest little soul I've ever known," she said, her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know how you're doing this, but I promise we'll be here with you every step of the way." Morning came too soon, and before they knew it, their baby was being prepped for surgery. The hours that followed felt like a lifetime. Mary and David sat together in the waiting room, their hands clasped tightly, neither of them speaking. There were no words that could ease the fear that gripped their hearts. When the surgeon finally walked through the doors, his face unreadable, Mary's breath caught in her throat. The news would either break them or give them the hope they so desperately needed. The waiting room was a silent battlefield. Every second that ticked by felt like an eternity for Mary and David. They sat together, clinging to each other, bracing for whatever news the surgeon would deliver. Time had lost all meaning. In their world, there was only before the surgery and after. As the surgeon approached, his face serious but calm, Mary felt her heart lurch. She squeezed David's hand tighter, her breath catching in her throat. She could hardly bear to look at the doctor, afraid of what he might say. "Your baby made it through the surgery," the surgeon said, his voice steady but cautious. "We were able to remove more of the mass, and the lungs responded well. But we're not out of the woods yet. The next 24 hours will be critical." Relief washed over Mary like a wave, but it was tempered by the doctor's words of caution. She wanted to celebrate, to believe that this was the turning point they had been waiting for, but she knew better than to let her guard down. The battle was far from over. David exhaled deeply, his shoulders sagging with the release of tension. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. The doctor nodded, offering a small but reassuring smile before leaving them to process the news. Mary sat in stunned silence for a moment, her mind racing. Their baby had survived yet another hurdle, and for that, she was endlessly grateful. But the road ahead remained long and uncertain. She turned to David, seeing the same mix of relief and fear reflected in his eyes. "One step at a time," he said softly, his voice filled with quiet determination. They were soon allowed to see their baby, who was now resting peacefully in the NICU. The sight of their child, so tiny and vulnerable, brought tears to Mary's eyes. The machines were still there, the tubes, the monitors, all the things that reminded her how fragile this life was. But there was also something new, a sense of hope that hadn't been there before. Their baby had survived the surgery, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was a real possibility of healing. The doctors had warned them about setbacks, about the risks that still remained, but for now, Mary chose to focus on the progress they had made. As the days passed, their baby continued to show signs of improvement. The medical team was cautiously optimistic, and Mary and David allowed themselves to begin believing that their baby might finally be on the path to recovery. Each day brought small victories, stable vitals, stronger breaths, longer stretches of peaceful sleep. The mass, once their greatest fear, was now mostly gone, and the baby's tiny body was healing. The progress was slow, but it was progress nonetheless. One afternoon, the doctor approached Mary and David with news they had longed to hear. "If the baby continues to improve like this," he said, "you may be able to hold your child soon." Mary's heart leapt at the words. It was the moment she had dreamed of for so long, the moment that had once seemed impossible. The idea of finally holding her baby, Feeling that little body close to her heart was overwhelming. Tears filled her eyes as she looked at David, who was equally overcome with emotion. "We're almost there," she whispered, her voice trembling with gratitude and joy. The day had finally come. After what felt like a lifetime of waiting, the doctors had given Mary and David the news they had been longing to hear. They could hold their baby. Mary's heart raced as the nurse carefully prepared the tiny infant, removing some of the tubes and wires that had been their lifeline for so long. She couldn't believe that this moment was real, that after all the fear, the surgeries, and the sleepless nights, she would finally be able to cradle her child in her arms. As the nurse gently placed the baby into Mary's arms, a wave of emotion surged through her, almost too powerful to contain. She had imagined this moment so many times, but the reality of it was more overwhelming than she could have ever prepared for. The baby was so small, so fragile, yet so warm and alive. Mary could feel the faint rise and fall of her baby's chest against her own, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever experienced. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she whispered, "You did it. You're so strong, my little miracle." David stood beside her, his eyes filled with tears of his own. For weeks, he had watched helplessly as their baby fought for survival, unable to do anything but hope and pray. Now, seeing his child in Mary's arms, the weight of everything they had been through seemed to lift, if only for a moment. He reached out, gently touching the baby's tiny hand, marveling at how something so small could endure so much. "We're so proud of you," David whispered, his voice thick with emotion. It was the first time he had spoken directly to their baby, and it felt like the beginning of something new, something hopeful. The medical team watched with quiet smiles, understanding the magnitude of the moment. They had seen countless parents go through similar journeys, but each one was unique, each one deeply personal. For Mary and David, this wasn't just about holding their baby for the first time. It was about everything they had overcome to get here. The fear, the uncertainty, the endless waiting. All of it had led to this moment of pure, unfiltered love. It was a moment that neither of them would ever forget. As the hours passed, Mary held her baby close, savoring every second. She had been through so much, but in this moment, none of that mattered. All that mattered was the warmth of her child against her skin, the gentle rhythm of the baby's breathing, and the knowledge that they had made it through the worst. David sat beside her, his arm around her shoulders, and together, they felt a peace that had eluded them for so long. It wasn't over yet, but they had taken a huge step forward, and that was enough for now. Later that evening, as the baby was carefully placed back into the incubator for monitoring, Mary and David sat in silence, holding hands and watching over their child. The road ahead was still uncertain, but they no longer felt alone in their fear. They had each other, and they had their baby, their little fighter who had proven time and again just how strong they could be. As the monitors beeped softly in the background, Mary whispered once more, "You're going to be okay. We're going to make it." The following days felt like a dream, a gentle transition from the nightmare that had consumed Mary and David's lives. The NICU, once filled with fear and uncertainty, now became a place of quiet hope. Their baby was growing stronger each day, and the doctors were cautiously optimistic. Though the monitors still beeped, and the tubes and wires remained, the baby's progress was undeniable. Every time Mary held her child, she could feel the strength returning, as if each touch, each whispered word, was part of the healing process. Mary began to bond with her baby in ways she hadn't been able to before. Now that she could hold her child regularly, she cherished each moment, the soft, warm weight of the tiny body in her arms, the delicate coos and movements. The fear that had once gripped her heart began to loosen its hold. There were still risks, of course, and the doctors reminded them that they weren't completely in the clear yet. But for the first time in months, Mary allowed herself to hope without reservation. Her baby was alive, and that was enough. David, too, found solace in the small victories they celebrated each day. The first time he held his baby in his arms, he was overwhelmed with emotion. The weeks of feeling helpless and powerless, of watching from the sidelines while Mary carried the burden, began to melt away. He felt a deep connection to the tiny life he cradled, a bond that was both fragile and unbreakable. Every time he looked into those bright, curious eyes, he saw a future that had once seemed impossible. "You're a fighter, just like your mom," he whispered, his heart full of pride and gratitude. As the baby continued to recover, the hospital staff began to prepare Mary and David for the next step, bringing their child home. The thought of leaving the safety of the NICU, where doctors and nurses were always within arm's reach, was both thrilling and terrifying. Mary had grown so accustomed to the routine, the constant monitoring, that the idea of being responsible for their baby's care was daunting. But at the same time, it was a milestone she had dreamed of. To bring their baby home, to finally lay them in the crib they had so lovingly prepared, it was the final piece of the puzzle. The doctors gave them a detailed plan, outlining the care their baby would need once they left the hospital. There would be follow-up appointments, therapies, and careful monitoring, but the worst of the medical interventions were behind them. Mary and David absorbed the information, determined to do everything they could to ensure their baby's continued health. The fear of another setback lingered, but it no longer overshadowed everything. They were ready to take the next step, to bring their baby into the world they had been waiting to share. Finally, the day arrived. The hospital staff gathered to say goodbye, their faces filled with warmth and encouragement. "You've all been our lifeline," Mary said tearfully as she hugged one of the nurses. "We couldn't have done this without you." David echoed her sentiments, thanking the doctors for their dedication and care. It was a bittersweet moment, leaving behind the people who had become like family, but also stepping into the future they had fought so hard to reach. As they bundled their baby into the car seat for the first time, Mary felt a mixture of joy, fear, and disbelief. They were finally going home as a family. The drive home was surreal. The streets that had once felt familiar seemed different now, bathed in the soft afternoon light, as if welcoming their family to a new beginning. Mary sat in the back seat, her eyes never leaving the baby who lay quietly in the car seat, bundled in a soft blanket. David drove carefully, his hands gripping the wheel as if the weight of the world was still on his shoulders. Though the fear hadn't completely disappeared, it was slowly being replaced by a sense of peace. They were taking their baby home, something that had once seemed like an impossible dream. As they pulled into the driveway, the house stood before them like a symbol of everything they had fought for. The nursery inside had been ready for months, untouched since the day they received the devastating news about the pregnancy. Now it was more than just a room. It was a sanctuary, a place of safety and love where their baby would grow and thrive. David carried the car seat into the house, and Mary followed, her heart racing with anticipation. This moment felt like the culmination of every sleepless night, every tear shed, every prayer whispered into the darkness. They entered the nursery together, the room filled with soft pastels and the scent of baby powder. The cribs, once meant for twins, stood side by side, a bittersweet reminder of how their journey had begun. Mary gently lifted her baby from the car seat and laid them in the crib. She had dreamed of this moment for so long, and now that it was here, she could hardly believe it. Tears filled her eyes as she sat down beside the crib, watching her baby's chest rise and fall with each peaceful breath. "Welcome home," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. David knelt beside her, his arm around her shoulders as they both gazed at the child who had transformed their lives. "We made it," he said softly, his voice full of gratitude. It had been the hardest journey they had ever faced, filled with moments of despair and hope in equal measure. But now, in the quiet of their home, they felt a sense of calm they hadn't known in months. The house, which had once felt empty and haunted by uncertainty, was now filled with love and the promise of a future they had dared to hope for. As the days turned into weeks, Mary and David slowly settled into their new routine. Caring for their baby at home was different from the structured environment of the NICU, but they adapted quickly, learning to trust their instincts as parents. Every milestone, no matter how small, felt like a victory. The baby's first coo, the first time they slept through the night, even the simple joy of feeding without complications. The medical appointments continued, and though there were still challenges, the baby's progress was steady, a testament to their resilience and strength. Mary often found herself sitting in the nursery, rocking her baby to sleep in the soft glow of the nightlight. The fear that had once gripped her so tightly had loosened its hold, replaced by a quiet confidence that they would face whatever came next together. She thought back to the early days, when everything had seemed so uncertain, and marveled at how far they had come. There were still moments of worry, still lingering questions about the future, but for now they were here at home, with their child in their arms. And that was enough. Months had passed since Mary and David brought their baby home, and their once fragile world had begun to settle into something that resembled normalcy. The house was now filled with the soft sounds of their child's laughter and the joyful chaos that only a baby could bring. The fear that had once overshadowed every moment slowly faded into the background, replaced by the simple joys of parenthood. Sleepless nights, first smiles, and the endless wonder of watching their child grow stronger each day. Mary often reflected on the journey they had been through. There were still moments when the memories of the hospital and the uncertainty of those early days crept into her mind, but they no longer held the same power over her. Their baby was thriving against all odds. Every time she looked into those bright eyes, she saw a future full of possibilities. The scars of the past were still there, but they were softened by the love and happiness that now filled their lives. The nursery, once a place of quiet sadness, was now a room bursting with life. The medical follow-ups continued, and the doctors remained vigilant in monitoring the baby's development. The abnormal mass that had once posed such a great threat was now just a memory, a chapter in their story that, while terrifying, had brought them to this moment of peace. The doctors marveled at how well their baby had recovered, and each appointment brought more good news. Mary and David still held their breath before every checkup, but with each visit, their confidence grew. They were no longer just surviving, they were living. David, who had once struggled to balance hope and fear, now embraced fatherhood with a new sense of purpose. He adored their baby, spending every spare moment playing, reading, and marveling at the small but significant milestones. He often reflected on how far they had come, grateful for the strength they had found in each other during the darkest moments. Watching their baby grow had deepened his love for Mary, and together, they felt more connected than ever before. The journey had changed them, but it had also made them stronger. As for Mary, she found herself finally able to breathe again. There were still moments of anxiety, but they no longer consumed her. She had learned to trust in the strength of her child, in the power of love and resilience. The fear that had once ruled her life was now just a reminder of how precious each moment was. She often sat by the crib, watching her baby sleep peacefully, and felt a sense of gratitude that was impossible to put into words. They had faced the unimaginable and had come out on the other side, not unscathed but whole. One evening, as the sun set and the house was filled with the soft glow of twilight, Mary and David sat together, their baby asleep in Mary's arms. The weight of the past months seemed to lift completely, leaving only the warmth of their love and the joy of their new life as parents. "We did it," David said quietly, his voice filled with awe. Mary smiled, resting her head against his shoulder. "We did," she whispered, "and we'll keep doing it. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." The future was still unknown, but they no longer feared it. They had survived the darkest of storms, and now they stood in the light, ready to embrace whatever life had in store for them. Their baby, once so fragile and uncertain, was now a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, miracles could happen. And as Mary looked down at the small face resting peacefully against her chest, she knew that their journey forward would be one filled with love, strength, and the unshakable bond they had built through it all. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more content like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And now, there's a new video appearing on the screen, full of unexpected twists and heartwarming moments. Click and get ready for another inspiring story.